Welcome to another video. This is Admas Kung Fu from supersqa.com. In this video, we're going to talk about a test case. What are test cases? We're just going to do a brief introduction of what those are, because so far in a lot of the lectures, you did hear me say test case this, test case that. So right now, let's just put a little bit light on that. So a semi-official documentation or description of what a test case is. A test case is a documented set of actions, inputs, and expected results used to verify a specific aspect of software functionality. Test case is a documented, right? That's the key. So far, we've been talking about test cases. Well, what if you click on this? You do this, what happens? If you do this, what happens? You have a requirement, it doesn't meet the requirements, right? Everything we've done, when we talk about test if it does this, test if it does that, those are test cases pretty much. But we just I've been verbally saying those things, that as a QA, it will be part of your responsibility to document those. And there are a few ways you can document it. A lot of people do use spreadsheets like Excel or Google Sheet, but there are professional tools where you can use to do that. And of course, I highly recommend using the professional tools because the spreadsheet is not really that scalable. So, and the key here is specific, okay? So every test case has to be very specific to what it's testing. You have to document specifically what it's doing. For example, in the header, we have a bunch of items in there, right? We should have a specific test case for each of the item instead of just saying, make sure items are there in the header, right? You could, but in the real world, you don't have time. So you kind of going to bundle things like that in reality. But by definition, test case is supposed to be very specific. So on interviews and things like that, you have to say, oh yeah, test case is like that little thing. Well, real world interviews, completely different things, right? All right, so it's a guide, systematic testing by outlining precise steps. So it's a guide on how to test by outlining precise steps. Validate requirements, ensures repeatability. The fact that you documented, the fact that you wrote it down allows you to repeat the test exactly the same way every single time. All right, so why does it matter? Why does it matter to document a test case? Clarity and organization. First, just basically whatever I've been saying, right? Clarity, you know exactly what to test and you're going to stay organized and you can communicate with other teams very efficiently. Risk mitigation, right? Like if you document the test cases and you say, hey, here are the test cases, I've executed them, the risk is less that you're going to miss something, especially the next round, right? Otherwise, you're just going to go by memory, you're going to try to remember what needs to be tested. And if you don't have it documented, you have a risk of missing something. Traceability, again, it goes with that. You trace things. You basically have a history of what has happened. What did you test? It actually takes pressure off of you, because later on, if management something goes wrong, like a bug happens and management comes to you and be like, hey, you didn't test this. You have a document saying I tested it. It was working at the time. Something might have changed since then or something like that. So it would help you investigate further. Reuse, that's the whole point. You document it so you can keep reusing it. So check out this slides. You have the slides. You can pause the video and just read this a little bit and just like process it. Think about what those things mean. In just plain English way. Okay. So a typical test case have several anatomy or several parts to it. Not everybody will use all these pieces in their test cases. Some people just use really lean test cases. Some people put a whole lot of details. So it all depends, but in general, a test case usually has an ID. It can be auto-generated if you're using some kind of tool, or if it could be an ID you assign to it if you're using like a spreadsheet like Excel. Then you always have a title. You usually have an objective or a purpose. Usually I just call it a description and I don't do objective or purpose. You have preconditions, basically to be able to execute that test. What is a precondition? For example, earlier we saw that in order to test out registration, user has to be logged out. You have to have a valid email available and you have to prepare a password. So those are preconditions. At least browser open, user is logged out, my account page is loaded. That is a precondition to do the registration test. So you will specify what that is. So this registration test is very straightforward, very simple, basic test. But depending on how complicated the application is, how complicated the feature you're testing is, you can imagine all the softwares you use every day, how complicated testing those things can be. So preconditions are really, really important in most cases. Steps, actions, those are the actual tests. What do you do to get to that point? What are the steps you take? Test data, you're going to need data. For example, if you're doing login test, you need a user that is already registered and has a value. That is data, right? So when you're testing something, you're going to need data for it. Let's say you're testing like a social media site where people are posting videos, posting images. You're going to need that information. You're going to need that data to post. You're going to need that data to post. Then you can test deleting. So test data, and you're going to specify where to get. In the test case, you're going to specify where to get the data and things like that. Expected result, just like what it sounds like. You're testing something. What is your expected result? What qualifies as a pass? Actual result, that's like I always see it, so I wanted to add it there, but normally it won't make sense to add actual results on a test case itself, on a test run. So you document the test case. When it's time to run it, you're going to create a copy of that, and you're going to just keep checking it. That's where you're going to put an actual result when you're running it. So professional tools would allow you to generate test run from test case. That's just a little side note. Pass-fail criteria, you can have that if you want, but for me, the way I work, I usually have the expected result, and that just tells me what the pass-fail criteria is. All right, so writing effective test cases, you have to be clear and concise. That's really important. So this is the kind of things they might ask you on interviews. What is the most important thing? The test case have to be clear and concise. It should be single purpose. One test case should test one thing, not a bunch of things. Use realistic data. Be independent. Each test case should be able to execute by itself. It should not depend on other test cases. You cannot say, run a test case for registration. Now that the user is registered, we have a user. Let's take that user and run a login test. You don't want the login test to depend on the registration. So now you can't run the login test without running registration test. So the login test case itself should explain that you need a user and explain the steps or the preconditions how to generate the user. So each test must be independent. That's kind of important. In automation, we try our best to do that, but sometimes it's just saves so much time, and sometimes we don't do it. But the rules, is to actually do that. Make sure each test case is dependent. Cover edge cases. Always test out edge cases. A good example for this is like you have a password field that has a maximum character of 20. So you're going to test it at 19. You're going to test at 20. You're going to test at 21. You're at the edge of what the limitation is. So usually you want to have test cases that cover edge cases. So this is what a typical test case looks like. You would have an ID, you have the title, you have the preconditions, the steps, expected results, actual results, and pass fail. I usually don't have those in the test case itself, but a precondition, steps, expected results, extremely important. The title and the description, of course, are important. Usually I skip the description because my titles are very self-descriptive. My titles will explain exactly what's going on. The steps are the most important part. That's what's going to show you what you're actually doing. So that is pretty much a test case. Now we're going to have another lecture where we look at test case management tools. So how do we document this? Where do we document this? I'll show you a tool called case.io. It's really popular. Well, it's really nice. I don't know about popular. It's fairly new, but it's so nice and it's free. There's a free version of it. And that's one. The other one is, of course, a spreadsheet. But let's go to another video and we'll talk about those tools on there. Okay. So this is a test case. This is like the main part of software testing, but you're going to just get to practice. It's more art than science. This literally is art because you have to look at something and be able to come up with the test. Like, how do I test it? How do I try to break it? How would a customer or a user break this? So you try to simulate what would a customer do. So there's way more art and artistic stuff with test cases than actual science, in my opinion. All right, so let's move on to the next one.